to first of all begin by welcoming Dr. Ryan Yonk, who's coming to us from Utah today. Thanks for being our guest expert on chemical risk, Dr. Yonk.
Oh, thanks, Graham. I'm happy to be here to talk a little more about some of the oddities that happen when you attempt to deal with risk from things like chemicals.
Exactly. Yeah, I appreciate it very much. Dr. Ryan Yonk is a remarkable person. He is a research fellow of the Independent Institute, but he's also program director in the Center for Public Choice and Private Enterprise at North Dakota State University. And I believe he has taught at other institutions in Utah and elsewhere. Another important thing I want to make sure everybody knows is that Dr. Yonk has an important research agenda behind him. A few years ago, he published with the Independent Institute this book, Nature Unbound, co-author here, which dealt with bureaucracy and the environment. I highly recommend that people take a look at this book. It is available through independent.org, our website, as well as through Amazon. And then more recently, I think just last fall, we published this book, In All Fairness, to which Ryan Yonk contributed a very important chapter on the difficulties with the policy of redistributionism. And this book, In All Fairness, came out last year, analyzes the quest for fairness, which people feel pretty strongly about, but in the light of other issues concerning human dignity and liberty and so forth. So take a look at In All Fairness. I recommend this book too. And Dr. Ryan Yonk has a key chapter in there. So today, however, we're inviting Ryan Yonk to join us because he and a couple of his colleagues were involved last year and finished in recent months this important research project on chemical risk analysis and mitigation. Now, that may sound like something that only policy wonks could love. Well, I'm a policy wonk, so maybe I loved it for that reason, Ryan. But you know, the more I looked at your thing, the more I realized it's going to have a lot of interest to other people. So here it is. If you want to go to our website, independent.org, you can see the briefing is called Precaution Can Kill. We give a preliminary summary here at independent.org. And if you want to download the entire PDF, it's also available on our website, Precaution Can Kill. Precaution Can Kill, quite a title. We kind of added that title later because of the context. This research was intrinsically interesting from the beginning, but I think that you and your colleagues did not realize when you launched into it how it would end up being addressing some principles that are aimed right at the heart of the COVID-19 crisis, because everyone's talking about how do we mitigate the risk of this crisis and all the stuff that we may need to do in relation to the crisis. And some of the principles that you deal with in this paper address that directly. That is to say, your point seems to be, in general, that with regard to chemicals at least, that we can be so cautious as to end up triggering a policy that causes more harm in the name of not causing harm. That's the general point, right?
Yeah, no, that's so it's true. I think in chemicals, I think there's some truth and some applications as we think about the current crisis. It's amazing how things can drop right into the middle of what's going on in an otherwise completely non-public health related research agenda that's mostly looking at regulatory approaches and those sorts of things. And yet it turns out the way we think about how regulation should happen, which are usually pointed right at trying to figure out how do we cope with risk. And so the work we did on chemicals, I think does have some general application to lots of the regulatory things we have that we're trying to deal with during the current crisis, especially as we think about, so how do we move forward on potential treatments and how do we move forward on making the right plan? And so from the outset, I'll say, I don't know what the right answer is, but there are some principles that we ought to be keeping in mind as we try to come up with what those answers are. And turns out they hold pretty true across most regulatory spheres.
Exactly. So, we're going to be talking about chemicals in detail very shortly here, but I just want to point out that the argument that you and your colleagues are making in this briefing, this independent briefing called Precaution Can Kill, is not that some risks are worth all the horrible consequences, but rather that every analysis of risk has to be multivariate and that avoiding some risks may in fact trigger others. That seems to be kind of the key thing. So if I could take you, I'm going to jump into the middle of this thing. We'll go back. I'm going to jump into the middle of this thing. But with regard to, medical matters, which are uppermost on people's minds these days, there's this whole section here of these case studies. The one that really caught my eye was this thing about ethylene oxide, which apparently is widely used for medical sterilization, and it became the target of risk nannies, if I could coin a term, risk nannies who didn't want to have any of the risk associated with ethylene oxide, but they ended up triggering some things they didn't intend. Tell us the story of ethylene oxide and medical sanitization, would you?
Well, so ethylene oxide been used for a long time in the process of medical sanitization, but there developed an increasing focus on the potential risks. There were maybe some things we didn't fully understand that could be risky, and that's sort of where a lot of the frame up of all three case studies come from, which is this could be risky. We don't know a lot about the risk. We may have some information that there's at least some potential risk, but folks got very focused on this idea that somehow we should be eliminating the risk in this regard. And that's really where a lot of these things come from, is this idea that we're going to eliminate risk. And
so from a just like a layman's point of view, so there's risk of having medical equipment that's not sterilized, and then there's risk from the stuff that you use to sterilize it.
Yeah, well, except that we often forget about that first bit of risk. So we often get really focused on the particular thing and the risks of using that chemical. And that's often what happens in chemical risk, is that we often forget that there's a reason why these chemicals got brought into the mix. There was a problem that they were trying to solve, and often it was dealing with something that was viewed as risky enough that we needed to solve the problem, and so a chemical's brought in. In the case of the medical sterilization, that's exactly what was going on, is there was potential risk, but then we come down the road a ways after we've solved one of the problems, and now we get focused on, okay, so what's the risk of this chemical? And we often forget the public policy reason that this all started with,
in the first place,
which led us there, and get narrowly focused on the potential risk of a particular chemical. And so part of what we're arguing is that you have to be cognizant of unintended consequences, which is my favorite thing to tell the undergraduates I work with. As soon as you start to play in public policy, you're going to spend a bunch of your life trying to figure out what are the unintended consequences that we're going to have by taking these actions. And
unintended is a really important word, because when you realize that at least half of public policy disputes, maybe more, but at least half are probably due to unintended consequences, as opposed to malicious, ill-intended policies. Oftentimes, those who advocate counterproductive policies have good things in mind. So in the story of the ethylene oxide in your independent briefing, you mentioned that the Environmental Protection Agency issued an assessment of risk of this particular sterilization agent in 2016. So what happened after that?
Well, so the story, as we think through what risk looks like, and so I tend to push back because I think big principles are more important than the specifics, Graham, and you're going to keep trying to drag me to the specifics.
Okay.
But the big principles, I think, are what are important here, in large part because when an agency like the EPA, and the EPA has a really specific mandate, their mandate is really clear. They are the folks that are meant to highlight the potential risks of these sorts of things. And so they step in and they identify what risks can be in a variety of chemicals across the board, or in a variety of actions that can affect the environment sort of generally, and human health more specifically. And then they step into the center of it, but they're only one voice in the policymaking system.
Right.
And often what happens is we get focused on that voice, and we forget that there are then going to be trade-offs if we eliminate the use, that we're going to be foreclosing the ability to use something if we listen to just that single voice that becomes very precautionary. And that's fundamentally what we really ended up doing in this briefing, was exploring the precautionary principle as a way of making public policy, and identified that there are some fairly large risks from doing that, because it forecloses all the other things that can happen and says the only thing we're going to care about is eliminating this one narrow risk because it's
Mhm.
possible something bad will happen.
Mhm.
And so in the case of ethylene oxide, if we eliminate it, it's an important sterilization feature, but suddenly we have a whole bunch of other risks that emerge from doing that.
Like unsterilized medical equipment.
Yeah, which is the big problem.
Insufficiently sterilized, or you have to resort to other less available agents to sterilize.
Or that may be less effective. They may require different protocols.
Right.
All those sorts of things that should be brought into the discussion of, okay, what are the risks to this? And what we're interested in is, how do we actually understand risk, and then how do we deal with that risk? How do we cope with risk? Because sadly, despite what my mother always wanted when I was a kid, she wanted me to grow up in a world where there was no risk.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
She quickly learned that wasn't possible.
Mothers are that way.
Right, and it's a really nice impulse, but it's an impulse that we can't achieve through public policy. And so we have to understand the risk. How do we react to it? How do we function in light of the fact that risk is going to exist? And then how do we hold people responsible when they increase risk dramatically in ways that they fundamentally should have known better? And that's what we explore.
Right. Usually they end up ignoring other kinds of risks because they're focusing on the one rather than the other. And so in the current, public policy climate around the COVID crisis, you can't help thinking about that. Many of the economic closures and restrictions that have been implemented have been undertaken because it will prevent people from dying from COVID-19, which is really, really valuable. So some people, they're saying we have to be super, super, super cautious because people might die from COVID-19. If it were that simple, and if the only expertise we needed was the expertise of epidemiologists, then that would be pretty simple. But in fact, the trouble is that some of the measures themselves undermine the medical infrastructure and other things. I read even that for every 1% increase in unemployment, there is a statistically measurable increase in suicide rate. So, we're not just talking about deaths versus no deaths. We're talking about different risks, different people ill-affected. Some people are going to die if we do this. Other people are going to die if we do that. It's a very difficult trade-off. And the precautionary principle, namely, avoid all possible risk from this one thing we're looking at, that precautionary principle apparently can cause harm.
Yeah, no, it clearly causes harm because it ignores the reality that trade-offs are both real and important. And this is, so one of the standard definitions of the precautionary principle is that it really comes down to four things that when you take the precautionary approach, you're going to try to do. And this is from Foss Hansen and a number of others that lay out this pretty well. And they're very upfront about what the precautionary principle looks like, because it starts with taking preventive action in the face of uncertainty. So the world is uncertain. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we're going to act to prevent the possibility of harm.
Right.
So that's the first thing.
Right.
And so we've seen a bunch of this, right, in recent weeks and months, and we've seen the morphing of public policy as uncertainty became risk over COVID-19. Right. Suddenly, some of those preventative actions didn't make as much sense.
Yeah, well, the key thing is they're going to prevent harm from the one thing they're focusing on.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So, and the thing, you call it the precautionary principle because the idea is to take action in advance to prevent any risk from ever emerging.
But normally that sounds really good, right?
It does sound good. I like the idea.
But there's a couple of other pieces that step in and how it gets applied, because it's not just that we're going to be proactive in the face of uncertainty, but we're going to shift the burden of responsibility onto the proponents of that potentially harmful activity. So if you're going to use ethylene oxide to sterilize medical, the burden of responsibility now flips to the people that want to use it to prove a negative in many ways, that in fact it is not harmful. And that's a problematic approach.
So those who want to prevent illness from unsterile medical equipment are then pitted against those who want to prevent illness from ethylene oxide being potentially harmful.
Yeah. Well, and those that would argue for a precautionary approach would say we're not arguing with those that want to prevent it, but what we're saying is you have to prove that this is safe. And one of the sort of cheap lessons I teach my undergraduates is proving a negative is almost impossible.
Yeah.
You can prove lots of affirmative claims, but proving a negative is virtually impossible. And so what it does is it prevents a whole bunch of action from happening. And then on top of those two things, so acting proactively, so you're doing it before we can even see whether or not there's harm, and it's now the responsibility of those who want to act to prove that there will be no harm.
Mm-hmm.
We then say we have to demonstrate that we have identified the range of alternatives and that this is still the best option.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to prove that it's not harmful and that it's the best option that we're going to take. And then we're going to layer on top of that a requirement that input from those who might be interested in this question, so activists and the general public, then are able to comment on whether or not they feel scared. And one of the things we know quickly is that individuals are relatively tough to scare, but groups of people are relatively easy to scare.
Right, isn't that weird?
And we've seen that. There's a psychological piece. And so you add all this up in the precautionary principle, and suddenly it's very difficult to introduce anything new into the system, precisely because you're acting ahead of time and you're requiring the person that wants to act to prove that they will cause no harm.
It kind of, using the precautionary principle as the touchstone of judgment in these matters has what is called, perhaps in other fields, a chilling effect.
Yeah.
And the metaphor is apt because, things get chilled, they freeze up and become immobilized. And then there's danger from the immobilization. I think you told us in this briefing that the precautionary principle has been enshrined as the touchstone of judgment in chemical risk in the European Union. Is that right?
Yeah. So the EU, starting in the early 1990s, began to use what they call the precautionary approach. It's not necessarily that Foss and his colleagues' definition, but they moved to a precautionary approach to chemical regulation that said, you have to deal with it beforehand, and you have to demonstrate that there's likely to be it's very unlikely there would be any harm from this chemical before you're allowed to introduce it. And in contrast, the US has traditionally run a slightly different approach, which is a cost-benefit analysis approach that says what you have to do is look at the costs and benefits between the two. And yeah, we recognize there are likely costs to using chemicals, but there are also likely benefits. And so they're supposed to use a cost-benefit analysis. But that's been increasingly problematic as places come up with lists of chemicals of concern and things that weight heavily the potential risk from a precautionary approach in that calculation.
Let me just point out that, if I understand this correctly, that both in the EU, who largely adopt the precautionary principle as their governing standard, and in the US, where there's more of a cost-benefit analysis, the focus in both cases is how should bureaucratic regulators make their control decisions?
Well, to be fair, governments are going to government, Grant.
That's true.
I like to say. And so one of the issues in the larger regulatory structure, and we explore this quite a bit in Nature Unbound in particular, is that often we're locked into this thinking that there is a regulatory approach that you can take that is a way to respond to these sorts of risk or the needs that emerge. And what we look at this, and this is, I have to give credit to my co-author Deanna Thomas for this idea, and Kevin Gomez, which is where a lot of this came from, was that, well, there may be a third option where companies are required to take responsibility for the harms that they might cause. So it's not that we don't view there as being risk or potential harm. They're real. There are real potential harms from these things, but that instead of making it a risk calculation that government officials do, individual companies make that risk calculation knowing that they could be held responsible for the harm that they cause. And so this is where I get to make no friends on either side of the aisle.
I was going to say,
love Independent Institute, because what I come out and say pretty clearly in the brief is we shouldn't be protecting companies from from the risk, from the costs that they impose on others. They should have to internalize them. By the same token, we can't expect government to be able to get these things right. That what we're looking for is a way to force those that make chemicals to internalize the costs.
Right.
I really want to say externality a whole bunch right here. But,
Okay.
But people cause externalities, meaning we affect other people. And what we can do, hopefully, is come up with a way to get people to internalize those things, those effects they have on other people. And so there may be a way to once we can demonstrate that there's harm, to compensate for the harm that could be done.
This is hard for people to get their head around, you know, because we're so used to thinking a different way, at the moment at least.
Yeah.
Our first, you know, recourse nowadays, because we're kind of habituated to it by our education, by media exposure and so forth, you know, how should governmental bureaucrats decide what policy to impose? Should it be the precautionary principle or the you know, risk and benefit analysis? Yeah, you can understand that, but there's a whole other way, which is, as you're saying, you call it the common law approach, which is simply an elegant historical way of pointing out that people who produce products using chemicals have to be exposed to the liability for the chemicals that they produce, and that they will be liable at law through the kind of accumulated process of court cases where people who believe that they have been harmed demonstrate or fail to demonstrate that they were harmed, and companies and the onlookers and the public see the pattern of decisions and liability, and you know, they are informed thereby, and ultimately companies are held accountable for what they do.
Yeah, and what it ends up meaning is that we have to deviate from two big trends in modern, especially U.S. regulatory policy approach, which is, on the one hand, ex ante regulation, where government steps in to say what the rules are to protect the public, and then on the other side, the set of regulations that then seek to protect business when they comply with those regulations from having to bear the cost of their actions at law. And so nobody loves this proposal from the political sides. They all hate it.
If I was like a chemical company CEO, I would say, oh, I would way rather hide behind, you know, hide under the apron strings of the EPA. If something I produce harms somebody, then all I have to say is, EPA said it's okay, but then I won't have that cover under your plan.
Right, and what that forces them then to do is to address the risks in the process of developing it, because they recognize that there are real costs that can be held. One of the interesting things, there's an interesting side effect to this approach, I think, that's worth sort of considering as we do some think experiment on this, and that is, so what sort of innovations would have to happen? What sort of innovations could happen if folks that were interested in producing in the chemical sphere or in the energy sphere had to bear those costs? How might they think about what it is they're producing, and the potential risks to the public and the potential benefits to the public as they go forward? And suddenly it requires them to bring a whole bunch of additional information into the process where they weigh out those risks. Now we can't go there. We can't like wake up tomorrow and suddenly have this be the world we're in. But it's a direction, I think, that is useful to think about.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, because precautionary principle sounds really good when you just think about it, because we want to protect people.
Yeah, on first glance.
Yeah, and then cost benefit. So often you then think about it, go, okay, you can get lots of folks to say, yeah, there might be things we're foreclosing, so we should be doing a cost benefit analysis. But both of those require what Hayek, the great economist, called the fatal conceit, this notion that somehow we can know enough to do the calculation on cost benefit in the face of uncertainty and lack of knowledge.
Well, government bureaucrats have a great track record of being omniscient, don't they?
Not generally.
Not really.
And it's unreasonable for us to think that we could ever get them to be.
Right.
But what we can get people to do is come up with ways to identify the information they're missing in the process, and then develop strategies to mitigate the potential harms. And that's really, when I think about regulation in general, that's my dream world, Graham, is that we get to a place where what the regulations are doing is they're requiring people to bear the costs that they create and innovate ways to mitigate those costs in the process.
What I find very intriguing about this way of thinking, which is kind of new to me, I mean, it shouldn't be so new, I guess, but intrigues me that on the one hand, somebody might say, oh, well, so you're going to depend upon companies being held accountable after the fact, rather than having bureaucrats make decisions before the fact. That sounds bad. But the more we think about it, the more we realize that that kind of actual and complete liability generates far more powerful incentives for chemical creators and distributors to do way more homework up front beforehand, because their liability after the fact is going to be so much greater. So they can afford now to be a little skimpy on the upfront precaution in their own work, because they know that they're not going to be, the EPA is going to rule on it, or somebody else is going to rule on it. So your system actually creates before the fact incentives for great precaution on the part of those who produce chemicals.
Right, because at a fundamental level, what we want a lot of precaution as people are innovating, so that they're thinking about the potential costs of what they're doing. But what we don't want is a complete freezing of the ability to innovate, especially in this sector, because there's a rule that says you can't do it until you can prove that there's no risk, and because everything has risk associated with it.
Right. It does.
Now there's a giant risk with the system that I propose, and that is that it gets captured by a bunch of lobbyists from either side, either those that are really worried about the risk or those that are, and lots of exceptions could get built in. And so you have to be cognizant that it's true real liability for these companies.
Right.
And it's in fact, they're responsible for the costs. And sometimes that will mean they calculate incorrectly and they go out of business. And
that will happen.
And I'm real comfortable with that. Unfortunately, it also
That's
means,
so heartless of you.
Well, I mean, so on the one side, that's going to be heartless, but at the same time, I'm saddened every time someone is harmed or someone dies. But we have a level of risk in society that we recognize every day. We presumably, I'm guessing you probably drove to the office or drove somewhere today, and there's risk there. And we don't end all of that in order to say we want no one to be harmed potentially by it.
Right.
But what we do is we let people think through their own risk tolerance there. And in many ways, that's what we advocate, is that as you create more clarity and more information in the system, people can better understand the risks that they're facing. And really, in many ways, this brings us right back around to the current pandemic issue, which is if people understand the risks and then can identify what that risk profile looks like, then we probably we can do things, I think, a whole lot better.
Right. One thing, I have a couple questions that have been written to me, I've received. I want to just toss your way in a minute. But one other thing in the text of the independent briefing called Precaution Can Kill, it was intriguing and kind of helpful to me, again, as a layman in this matter, the way you distinguished type 1 from type 2 harms. Nutshell summary of that, please.
Well, so there are really these two types of harms. One is the direct harm from whatever the chemical is in the brief that we talk about. That's a direct harm. That's one type of harm or one type of risk.
Like ethylene oxide or the flame retardant chemicals
or
chlorine in
drinking water.
Yeah.
All those sorts of things. That is clearly, it's also the risk that we often are most able to identify, and like it's easiest to think about because it's the direct linked risk. And then there's a second sort of risk, and that's the risk that emerges, or the harm that emerges when we say, okay, this is now gone. We can't do that, but there's a set of harms and risks that emerge by taking that action. And those are tougher to think about, but they're no less real.
Yeah, exactly.
And so as we think about mitigating risk, especially from chemicals, understanding that both types of risk exist and both type of harm can exist is important in policy making.
Right.
Because we're wanting to deal with the as much as possible the whole scope of risk that happens.
Right. Exactly.
Because simply eliminating chlorine from water, for example, means we take a lot of water purification options off the table. And the U.S. we can do that in the U.S. probably.
We have the luxury, maybe.
We do, maybe. But lots of places that are just reaching a wealth level where they're now starting to deal with it, if we take all those things off the table for them, then there are real costs that are going on that we often don't think about in a meaningful way.
Yeah,
and we should be in public policy.
Yeah, that's very, very important. And it's like, again, going back to the current crisis, we want to keep all the hospital beds open for the COVID patients so that they don't die. And I really appreciate that, because, you know, if I get it, I want a hospital room.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the means toward that end, one of the means toward that end was to close down all non-essential or elective medical procedures, which then harmed people's health in other ways that they weren't getting their treatment, and moreover, degraded the revenue supply for the medical community and hospitals, weakening medical care, which will have a bad medical effect, even maybe a fatal effect on some people too. So you got to look at all the risk of doing the thing and of not doing the thing.
So one of the interesting things that comes from that we've seen in some of the data is somewhere a bunch of heart attacks and strokes just stopped happening, except that there's no way they actually stopped happening. It meant that people didn't seek treatment necessarily for them because they were afraid to go, or
they weren't allowed to, because at the point where they would have gone, it was, you know, elective, and therefore non-essential, therefore not permitted.
And so what we want to be doing is thinking about those things. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a policy answer, but policy should be taking those things into account. And it turns out, as we become increasingly bad at recognizing that, as polarization has increased, as we divide into sides on issues, it's much harder to take that wide look at the potential impacts in public policy. And it's one of, I think, the real potential issues that's emerging as we sort of tribalize in politics. And so now the little bit of a political scientist in me is coming out, because I can't help it, because I think there's a risk that emerges there as well.
So I would just say that for many of our participants today, you really want to go onto our website and download this PDF of this independent briefing on chemical risk, Precaution Can Kill, if only because there is an analytical tool here in this very seemingly simple distinction between type 1 and type 2 risks, a very useful analytical tool that you can apply to a lot of the issues that we're dealing with today. Chemical risk for sure, but a lot of other things too. So go look. We're not stopping yet, but I was telling him, pausing here to remind you, go get the briefing, read it, and then find the part about type 1 versus type 2 risk. And I think you'll find the distinction remarkably helpful. And I'm grateful to you and your colleagues for coming up with that. So here's a question that I got in writing. The precautionary principle you discuss, says this person, the precautionary principle you discuss regarding chemical regulation seems to have many analogous cases, such as the concerns about GMOs or the development of nuclear energy. A common theme is that these developments are unnatural. What do you make of this sort of argument?
Well, so again, I would say, if you read Nature Unbound, there's lots. We have a fairly detailed discussion in that book about what
Nature Unbound. Buy it today.
Yeah, I mean, I'll shill for the book, absolutely. I think it's worth reading, but I don't find the natural versus unnatural distinction terribly useful. I just don't. It's not a way that I have found helps me to identify what to do in terms of public policy. Partly because I don't view the actions of human beings as being somehow entirely separate from nature. Right,
that's the trouble.
And that part of then what happens, and I think the questioner is exactly right, that there are lots of analogous cases, and so I would frame it up a little bit differently than the natural unnatural. I think I'd frame it up as what's common among those things are that we have intervention into a system where there's uncertainty about the potential outcome, although that uncertainty drops as we learn more and more. So we learn more about GMOs, and we see that we know way more that there's less risk. than people speculated there was.
Mm-hmm.
We know more about nuclear power, and we can identify now. We've moved largely from uncertainty to risk,
Mm-hmm.
and in doing that, often the precautionary principle would suggest that until we knew all the answers, we should take no action on allowing those things to happen.
Right.
But if we take no action, we're not likely to ever put together a set of incentives that leads us to getting those answers.
Mm-hmm.
And so we end up stuck without the ability to innovate. And so those sorts of questions, I think, are why these questions around the precautionary principle, there are lots and lots of analogous cases. It's not just chemical regulation.
No, clearly not. Yeah.
It's used across a fairly wide variety. And we want to be thinking about what are we foreclosing in all of those situations. Mm-hmm. And the costs of banning nuclear might mean that we stay tied to fossil fuels, which has its own costs and benefits.
Right.
And we want to think about those risks and harms as we go forward. I mean, merely suggesting the precautionary principle doesn't work doesn't mean that that I can tell you what the right policy is.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It's just that approach limits our ability to innovate and to think through and to account for the totality of harm that might happen from a particular action or inaction.
Again, I'll invoke, your distinction between type 1 and type 2. There's the harm that's going to come from the thing that you want to get rid of, and then there's the harm that's going to come from forbidding it.
Yes.
The thing might cause harm, but then forbidding it may cause harm.
Right.
And, nuclear is certainly a good example. The questioner is right. I am far from being an expert on this, and I'm not sure what the right answer is. But obviously, on the one hand, there's the risk of the nuclear reactors gone wrong, but at the same time, there's the risk of carbon-based pollution, which allegedly is going to kill off human life through global warming. So,
and this is where, if we had full information, I would love the cost-benefit analysis approach. I love that approach if we have lots and lots of information about these things. But in the face of uncertainty, it's almost impossible to do a good cost-benefit analysis. And so that common law approach really pushes us back to say, we recognize that the world is uncertain. And one thing we're going to agree on as a principle is you should be responsible for the actions you take and the harm that is caused by you taking those actions. And if we do that, suddenly what I really hope for is a world in which the innovator is the precautionary person.
Yeah.
They're thinking about it as opposed to government saying, this is the precaution that has to be taken.
Right. So another question I got here is, shouldn't we take the better safe than sorry approach? And I think you've been answering that all the way along. No.
Well, I mean, because again, this is one of those where it's a truism that sounds really good. We should be better safe than sorry. Mm-hmm. Well, what is safety? There's a whole literature on seeking for safety and what does safety mean and all those sorts of things. And what is it? I'm not certain we have a good answer of what it means to be safe.
Yeah. Safe from one thing might make you at risk of harm from another thing. Yeah,
and this is one of the core. I think this is where putting on my econ hat is generally pretty helpful, because really what we're talking about is, if we're going to be better safe than sorry, it means we're going to say any risk is unacceptable, and we're not going to acknowledge trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And so we will ultimately not be able to act at all. Whereas the economist in me says there are going to be trade-offs, and some of those trade-offs are going to have risk associated.
Right.
But we have to figure out how to move forward. We can't all hide in our hidey holes for the rest of our lives. And
we can't.
Risk.
What I find especially satisfying, I think, seeing this from a very large or a high level, is that under a actually vigorous and authentic rule of law that is enforceable, and where we have a tort system where people can actually seek redress and compensation for harms done to them by others, and that rule of law, that legal system, is not captive to interests. Under those conditions, with liberty to make economic decisions, individuals, families, and companies may actually be able to regulate and accommodate and balance these risks in a very appropriate way going forward, even though they're complex. But it's because under the rule of law and with strict liability, people will take care because they're going to be held accountable because of the law, because you got freedom and you use it under the law and you can't harm other people, right? That's basically what a rule of law is.
That's the rule.
And if we have that kind of system, it'll work.
Yeah, and if you do harm other people, you're responsible for mitigating the harm that you did.
Yeah, exactly.
And so often we often are seeking for safety. Right. And seeking for safety often leads us down paths where we end up limiting individuals' abilities to act, and ultimately we don't actually end up any safer in the end. We end up safe from one thing but open to risk from another.
Yeah, I mean, I sure don't want to live in a society that's ossified and immobilized and impoverished because of lack of creativity and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, we want to free the entrepreneur, because the entrepreneurial action, I mean, you want to talk about if you had a centrally regulated approach to something like for example the polio vaccine, we might have a great iron lung, but it's not likely we'd have ended up with a vaccine.
Yeah, exactly.
It would have always been too risky. But there was risk in introducing a vaccination, and yet that innovation was important. And we want to keep a society where innovation is happening and functioning in a meaningful way. Absolutely.
Well, let me kind of draw this to a close then. It's been a pleasure talking with Dr. Ryan Yonk today about chemical risk and really the dangers of the precautionary principle applied to chemical and other kinds of risks. It's been a very illuminating discussion. I do encourage everybody to go to the Independent Institute website. It's independent.org, where you can find, today at least, we just published it there in the center, you can find a place where you can download this independent briefing, Precaution Can Kill. Encourage you to do that. Also encourage you to take a look at some of the books that Dr. Ryan Yonk has been a contributor to. For instance, last year we published In All Fairness. He's got a great chapter in here on the dangers of redistributionism. Wonderful book that deals with the problems of egalitarianism. In general, the Independent Institute exists to create a deep bank of resources, research and publication that enables people to see the merits of a kind of society built on liberty, free choice, the rule of law, and human dignity. Those principles have a bearing on a lot of our issues. They don't always bear on a right-left partisan way. Oftentimes, we come at it from a totally different angle. That's why people turn to the Independent Institute, because we have angles that are not easily categorized, as I think you saw today in the work of Dr. Ryan Yonk. So again, Dr. Ryan Yonk, thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Graham. It was fun to come chat about it.
It's a pleasure, and we look forward to seeing all of our friends on ThinkSpot and Facebook and elsewhere again. Thanks for coming to the Independent Institute. Take care.